The first day it began on a quiet morning in California, when Sundar Pichai left his house before sunrise. He loved those early hours when the streets were still empty, the air crisp, and the world felt calm. Today he had an important meeting, but more than that, he was thinking about his family back in India. He missed his mother's soft voice and his father's quiet wisdom. He often told himself that no matter how much success he had found, he was still the boy who grew up in a two-room apartment in Chennai, sleeping on the floor and dreaming of a bigger world. As he walked toward his car, he felt it, a faint chill. At the back of his neck, he stopped, looked around. A few joggers ran past him on the sidewalk. Nothing unusual. Yet something about the way the shadows moved behind a tree caught his eye. Someone was there, but when he blinked, the shadow was gone. Shrugging it off, Sundar drove to the office. His days were always full of decisions that could change the lives of millions. Meetings, emails, interviews. People looked at him with admiration and fear, but inside, he was just trying his best not to let them down. His team depended on him, and he never forgot the pressure of carrying all their hopes. But all day, he felt uneasy. During lunch, he caught sight of a figure outside the glass walls of the cafeteria. Someone in a plain gray jacket, standing very still. Sundar paused mid-sentence. His colleague asked him if he was okay. He smiled faintly and said yes. But his heart was pounding. After work, he decided to walk a bit before driving home. The sun was setting now, painting the sky with deep orange and pink. Sundar liked to watch the sunset because it reminded him of the evenings in his childhood, when he sat on the roof with his father and listened to the radio. He walked through a park, feeling the soft grass under his shoes. Families were sitting on benches, children were playing, and everything looked peaceful. Yet, in the corner of his eye, there it was again, the gray jacket, leaning against a tree. Watching him, he stopped, turned. This time, the stranger did not move. Sundar took a step toward him, and the stranger melted back into the shadows. That night at home, Sundar stood at the window of his quiet bedroom. The city lights blinked below. He thought about calling someone. Security maybe, but he didn't. It felt strange to admit he was afraid. After all, he was one of the most powerful men in the world. What harm could come to him here? But then he saw it, across the street from his building, a gray figure standing perfectly still under a street. Sundar's hands grew cold. He closed the curtains. Tried to sleep, but all night he kept thinking, who was it, and why were they following him? By morning, Sundar made a decision. If the stranger was going to follow him, then he would find out why. He left his house earlier than usual, walking instead of driving. The streets were even emptier than the day before. He could almost feel the silence pressing against his ears. Halfway down the block, he glanced back, and there he was. The stranger, closer this time. Sundar stopped walking, and turned around completely. He called out, "Why are you following me?" But the man in the gray jacket simply tilted his head, as if considering whether to answer. Then he slowly raised his hand, not in greeting but pointing at Sundar's chest. Sundar looked down at himself. Nothing unusual. When he looked back up, the man was gone. Just vanished. Later that day, during a meeting, Sundar couldn't stop thinking about that moment. He felt as though the stranger had seen something in him that even he didn't know. Something he had forgotten. Something he was about to discover. That evening, he checked his phone and found a message from an unknown number. It said, "You have 3 days. Don't waste them." Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew this was just the beginning. When he looked up from the screen, the gray figure was standing outside the glass doors of his office, watching, waiting, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sundar felt a strange mix of fear and determination. He would find out who this stranger was, even if it meant unraveling everything he thought he knew about himself. The next morning, he would begin his search. But as he lay awake that night, he had no idea that the truth would break his heart before it set him free. The second day woke before dawn, his mind heavy with thoughts of the stranger. The message still glowed on his phone screen, those simple words whispering at him like a warning he could not ignore. "You have 3 days. Don't waste them." He had not slept much, and when he did, his dreams were restless and strange. He kept seeing the man in the gray jacket standing silently at the foot of his bed, his face hidden in shadow, his hand still pointing towards Sundar's chest. When he finally got up, he stood by the window for a long time, staring out at the sleeping city. It was beautiful and cruel, he thought, how the world could look so calm while something inside you was breaking open. By the time the sun rose, Sundar was already dressed and walking. Today, he chose a different route, winding through narrow streets and quiet alleys he hadn't walked in years. He told himself he was just going to the office early, but the truth was, he was looking, watching. Every reflection in a shop window, every sound of footsteps behind him, made his heart beat a little faster. Yet somehow, he also felt more alive than he had in months. Every detail of the world seemed sharper, the smell of bread baking in a corner cafe, the golden light spilling across the pavement, the laughter of 2 kids chasing each other near a fountain. But even in that beauty, the unease stayed with him. In one alley, he caught sight of the gray jacket again, this time closer. The man was standing at the mouth of the alley, leaning against the bricks, arms folded, waiting. Sundar froze. He wanted to walk straight up to him and demand answers, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the air between them was too heavy, filled with something he could not name. When he finally blinked, the man was gone again, but this time Sundar could hear footsteps retreating down a side street. Without thinking, he followed. He ran. His polished shoes slipped on the damp stones, and his breath came fast, fogging the morning air. He turned corners blindly, catching glimpses of the gray figure just ahead, always just out of reach. At one point, he thought he had him trapped at the end of a narrow dead-end lane. But when Sundar reached it, the man was no longer there. Only silence remained thick and unnerving. Frustrated, Sundar leaned against the wall to catch his breath. That's when he noticed something new. A folded piece of paper on the ground where the stranger had stood. He picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, and it said, "You still don't understand what you've lost. Look closer." Beneath the words was a small black and white photograph. Sundar stared at it for a long time. It was a picture of him, a much younger him, standing on the roof of his childhood home in Chennai, wearing a faded school uniform, a radio beside him. His head tilted back as if listening to the sky. His throat tightened. He remembered. That day, though barely, it was the day his father had told him about sacrifice, about what it meant to dream not just for yourself but for everyone who came after you. But how could this stranger have such a photo? No one outside his family had ever seen it. Shaken, Sundar put the photo in his pocket and walked the rest of the way to his office. The day passed in a blur of meetings and conversations he barely heard. His assistants looked at him strangely, and once or twice someone asked if he was feeling all right. He just nodded and forced a smile, but inside, questions clawed at him. Who was this man? How did he know about Sundar's past? And what exactly was it that Sundar had lost? As the afternoon turned into evening, Sundar decided he couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. He excused himself early and slipped out of the office without telling anyone. Instead of going home, he went to an old neighborhood on the edge of the city, a quiet place where he used to live before his rise to the top. The buildings there were worn and faded now, but they held memories he couldn't forget. He thought maybe the stranger was trying to lead him back here, to something he had missed. He walked slowly past shuttered shops and dark windows until he reached the park where he used to sit and think on difficult days. The bench he liked was still there, though the paint had peeled and weeds grew through the cracks in the pavement. He sat down and closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the park. He felt as though he was waiting for something, though he didn't know what. After a long while, he opened his eyes, and there, the stranger was standing on the far side of the park, under a flickering street lamp, watching him. This time, Sundar didn't hesitate. He stood and began to walk toward him, his hands curling into fists at his sides. When he was only a few feet away, he could finally see the man's face, or rather, what little of it was visible beneath the shadow of his hood. The man's eyes were dark and steady, and for a moment, Sundar thought he saw something familiar in them. "Who are you?" Sundar demanded, his voice low but fierce. "Why are you doing this?" The stranger didn't speak. Instead, he held out another folded piece of paper and placed it gently on the bench Sundar had just vacated. Then he stepped back, still silent. Sundar's fingers shook as he opened the note. This one said, "You forgot who you are. Find her before it's too late." And beneath the words was another photograph. This time it showed a woman, young, smiling, standing on a railway platform with a suitcase beside her. Sundar's breath caught as he stared at her face. His mind reeled, memories flooding back. So fast they almost knocked him to his knees. He knew that face. He had loved that face once, long ago, in a life he had buried beneath ambition and distance. Before he could look up, the stranger was already gone. Sundar stood there in the empty park, clutching the photograph, his heart beating wildly, his mind full of questions and regrets. Somewhere out there, she was waiting, or maybe she wasn't waiting anymore. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had to find her. And as the wind picked up, rustling the trees and whispering through the night, Sundar realized that whatever happened next would change him forever. He turned toward the darkened streets, the photograph still in his hand, and began to walk, unaware that the stranger was still watching him from the shadows. A faint smile on his lips, the search begins tonight, felt heavier than usual as Sundar walked home, clutching the photograph of the woman in his hand so tightly it crumpled at the edges. Her eyes stared up at him from the picture, wide and alive, full of something he could only describe as quiet defiance. He remembered those eyes. How could he forget? Once, long ago, she had been his everything. Her name was Anjali, and he hadn't spoken it out loud in more than 20 years. Even saying it in his mind now felt like opening a wound he thought had healed but had only been covered. That as he lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. The ceiling above him seemed to press down, each tick of the clock louder than the last. He thought of her laugh, of the way she used to stand at the edge of the railway platform in Chennai, waiting for him after his long days at college. She would bring him sweet tea in a steel cup and listen to him talk about his dreams. She never interrupted, never doubted him. She only smiled, as if she already believed more in him than he believed in himself. But then came the scholarship, the flight to America, the endless work, the years that passed too fast. When he finally looked up, she was gone. And he told himself that was how life worked. Some things you had to leave behind. But now, holding her photograph under the dim light of his bedroom, he wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, before the sun rose, Sundar got dressed and left the apartment. He skipped his usual routine, didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he couldn't ignore the stranger's message. Find her before it's too late. Those words had settled deep in his chest like stones. He walked into the old neighborhood again, the one that still carried the smell of dust and rain, where small shops opened with the sound of metal shutters rolling up, and old men sat outside, sipping tea. It was the kind of place where faces never really changed, only grew older. Maybe someone here remembered her. Maybe someone could tell him where she had gone. At first, people looked at him with suspicion. He was dressed too formally for this part of town, and his quiet way of speaking didn't fit the rhythm of their busy morning. But when he showed them the photograph, something shifted. One shopkeeper, a man with a white beard and warm eyes, took the photo in his hands and stared at it a long time. She used to live here, the old man said finally, his voice soft but heavy. But not anymore. Do you know where she went? Sundar asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man nodded slightly, then pointed down the street. There's a woman who runs the flower stall at the corner. She was her friend. If anyone knows, she will. Sundar thanked him and walked quickly toward the flower stall. The woman behind the counter was arranging marigolds into a garland when he arrived. She glanced up at him, then at the photograph he held out. Her hands froze. You're too late, she said simply. Her tone, somewhere between sorrow and accusation, felt his stomach drop. What do you mean? The woman sighed, looking at him as if she wanted to say more but couldn't. She reached under the counter and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to him without another word. When Sundar unfolded it, he saw a single address written in careful handwriting, along with a date. Today's date. He looked up to ask her what it meant, but she had already turned away, busying herself with the flowers again. Sundar felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He stepped away from the stall, staring at the paper in his hand. The address was on the other side of the city. He didn't know what waited for him there, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He hailed a cab and sat silently in the back as the car wound through the crowded streets. Outside the window, the city rushed by, children chasing each other through alleys, vendors shouting over the noise of buses, a woman balancing a basket of fruit on her head as though it weighed nothing at all. It all blurred together, but Sundar couldn't stop thinking about the stranger's eyes, about how familiar they had looked when he confronted him in the park. The car finally pulled up in front of a small, weathered building. Sundar stepped out slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The building looked abandoned, its windows dark and its walls covered in faded posters. But when he pushed the door open, he found himself in a narrow hallway, lit by a single flickering bulb. At the end of the hallway was a door, and on the door was another note, written in the same precise handwriting as before. It said, "You made your choice. Now face it." He hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. Inside was a small, quiet room. The walls were bare, except for a single chair in the center, and sitting in that chair, wearing the same gray jacket, was the stranger. But this time, the stranger removed his hood, and Sundar staggered back, gasping at what he saw. The face that stared back at him was his own. Not exactly the same. Younger, sharper, with eyes that burned with something he hadn't seen in himself in decades. But it was him, unmistakably him. The younger. Sundar tilted his head and gave a faint, bitter smile. "You left her," he said softly. "You left me." The words hit him like a blow. Sundar stood frozen in the doorway, his mind spinning. He didn't understand how this was possible, but the weight of the truth was already sinking in. The stranger had been himself all along, the part of him he had abandoned, the part that remembered what it felt like to love without ambition, to dream without fear, to put someone else before himself. The younger Sundar reached into his pocket and held out the photograph of Anjali again. "You have until midnight," he said. "After that, she's gone." Sundar stared at the photo, his hands shaking, and when he finally looked back up, the younger version of himself was gone, leaving nothing but silence and the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. Before midnight, the air outside the building felt different now, colder, sharper, as if the city itself had changed while Sundar was inside. He stood on the sidewalk staring down at the photograph of Anjali still clutched in his hand. His younger self's voice echoed in his head. "You have until midnight. After that, she's gone." Those words carried a weight he didn't fully understand, but he knew this was not a metaphor. Not just some symbolic warning. Something real, something final was about to happen, and he couldn't afford to waste another second. He began walking without thinking, then broke into a run. The streets blurred around him. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete, his breath coming fast and uneven. Strangers turned to look at him as he passed, but he didn't care. His mind was a storm of memories and questions. How could it have come to this? How had he become the kind of man who needed to be chased down by his own younger self to remember what truly mattered? At the edge of the city, he found himself back at the flower stall. The woman was still there, stringing marigolds by the faint light of her lamp. She didn't even look surprised to see him again. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice low, but cracking with urgency. "Please, I need to find her. Tell me where she is." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes dark and unreadable. Then, without a word, she handed him another folded paper. His fingers trembled as he opened it and read the address inside. This time it was a hospital, one he recognized, though he hadn't set foot in it for years. "Go," the woman murmured. "You've already wasted too much time." Sundar nodded, once, too choked up to speak, and ran again through the crowded streets, through the honking traffic, through the heavy evening air. He didn't stop until he stood in front of the hospital's glass doors, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands cold despite the heat. Inside, the hospital smelled of antiseptic and something heavier, sorrow, maybe, the kind of smell that never really leaves you. The corridors were quiet, except for the soft murmur of nurses at their stations and the steady beep of machines behind closed doors. Sundar walked slowly now, each step heavier than the last. The younger Sundar's words came back to him. "You left her. You left me. At the end of the hallway he found a small waiting room where an elderly nurse sat behind a counter. She looked up when he approached, and her eyes softened when they met his. "I'm looking for her," he whispered, showing the photograph of Anjali. "Please, tell me she's here." The nurse nodded slowly, as though she had been expecting him all along. She stood and motioned for him to follow. They walked down another long hallway, then turned a corner into a quiet ward where the lights were dim and the air felt even heavier. She stopped at a door and laid a hand on it before speaking. "She's inside," the nurse said gently, "but you should know. She doesn't have much time." Sundar's knees felt weak. He reached for the door handle but froze, suddenly, terrified of what he would find on the other side. How many years had passed since he had last seen her? Would she even want to see him now? Would she recognize him? Or would she turn away, hurt and angry? But then he thought of her smile, the way she used to wait for him at the train station, her hands wrapped around that little cup of tea, her eyes so full of quiet hope. And he knew he couldn't turn back now. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the machines and the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze from a small open window. And there she was, lying on a narrow bed, her hair streaked with gray, now, her face thinner but still unmistakably hers. Her eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment he thought he was too late, but then she stirred, and her eyes fluttered open. They locked on him immediately, and the faintest shadow of a smile crossed her lips. "You came," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely reached him. Sundar took a few steps closer, his throat tight, his eyes stinging. "Of course I came," he said, though it felt hollow somehow, because the truth was he should have come long before this moment. He should never have left her in the first place. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes still sharp despite the years. "You look different," she murmured, "older, tired." He gave a small, broken laugh. "I feel older, and tired, and still stubborn," she added, her smile faint but teasing. He reached out and gently took her hand in his. It was frail now, the skin thin and cool to the touch, but it still felt like home. "I'm sorry," he said, the words falling out of him like stones. "I'm sorry I left. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I worked hard enough, but became someone important enough, it would mean something. But I forgot what really mattered. I forgot you." Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything, only squeezed his hand weakly and closed her eyes again. He sat there for a long time, just holding her hand, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor. The weight of all the years between them pressed down on him. He wanted to tell her everything, about how he thought of her every time he achieved something, how he sometimes saw her face in dreams and woke up with tears on his pillow. But the words stuck in his throat. Then he felt it, a presence in the room. He looked up and saw the younger version of himself standing silently in the corner. His arms were crossed, and he was watching Sundar with an unreadable expression. "What now?" Sundar asked quietly, not letting go of Anjali's hand. The younger Sundar tilted his head slightly and finally spoke. "You've found her, but you still haven't faced yourself." Sundar frowned. "What does that mean?" The younger Sundar stepped closer, his eyes dark and steady. "She's not the only one you left behind." Before Sundar could respond, the lights in the room flickered, and suddenly the younger Sundar was gone again, leaving nothing but silence and the faint echo of his words. He looked back down at Anjali, whose breathing had grown shallow now. Her hand trembled in his, and her lips moved as if trying to form words. He leaned closer, straining to hear. "You have to forgive yourself," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "before it's too late." And then her eyes closed. Again, the monitor beeped steadily, but Sundar's chest felt hollow. He sat there, staring at her, the tears finally spilling over. His mind full of questions he couldn't yet answer. What did the younger Sundar mean? Who else had he left behind? And what would happen when the clock struck midnight? As the wind rattled, the window and the city outside moved on, Sundar realized that his journey wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. The buried truth room was very quiet after Anjali drifted back to sleep. Sundar sat at her bedside, still holding her hand, staring at the faint lines in her face and the fragile rise and fall of her chest. Outside the hospital window, the city glimmered under a black sky, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cut through the night. It sounded almost exactly like the one he used to hear as a boy lying awake on hot summer nights in Chennai, dreaming about a bigger life. But now, as he sat in the dim light of that hospital room, he couldn't stop asking himself one question. How many people had he left behind on his way to that bigger life? He thought of the younger Sundar's words again. She's not the only one you left behind. He didn't understand what that meant yet, but it settled into his chest like a stone. After a long time, the elderly nurse came quietly into the room and touched his shoulder. Her face was kind but firm, and she murmured that Anjali needed to rest now. Sundar hesitated, then slowly rose and tucked the blanket more securely around Anjali's shoulders. He bent down, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered, "I'm not done yet, I promise." As he stepped out into the hallway, the air felt colder somehow. The lights above him flickered faintly, and he became aware of how empty the hospital felt at this late hour. He walked aimlessly down the corridors until he reached the lobby, but when he stepped outside, he stopped dead in his tracks. Up there, across the street, under the orange glow of a street lamp, stood the younger Sundar again. His gray jacket hung loose in the breeze, and his dark eyes were fixed directly on him. Sundar squared his shoulders and crossed the street, each step heavier than the last. "What do you want from me?" Sundar asked, his voice quiet but hard. The younger Sundar tilted his head, his lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. "You're asking the wrong question," he said softly. "The question isn't what I want. It's what you need." Before Sundar could speak again, the younger version reached into his pocket and handed him another folded paper, heavier this time, as if something more than just words was inside. Sundar unfolded it slowly. Inside was a photograph, black and white, frayed at the edges. It showed a boy, no more than 10, sitting on the floor of a cramped room with a cracked radio beside him, scribbling numbers into a battered notebook. Sundar recognized himself immediately, but it was what was in the background that made his stomach twist. Behind the boy stood his father, half turned away, carrying a heavy toolbox out the door. The look on his father's face was one Sundar had never noticed before, not the quiet strength he always remembered, but something else entirely. Something like sorrow or resignation. Below the photograph, written in the same neat handwriting, were just 3 words: "Go back home." Sundar's breath caught. It had been years, decades, since he had set foot in his childhood home. He told himself he'd been too busy, that there wasn't time, but deep down he knew the truth. He hadn't gone back because he was afraid of what he'd find there. He looked up from the paper, but the younger Sundar was already gone again. The street lamp flickered once, then went dark, leaving Sundar standing alone in the cool night air. With the photograph trembling in his hands, he didn't hesitate this time. He called a car and told the driver to take him straight to the airport. The flight to Chennai felt longer than it really was. He stared out the window most of the way, watching the clouds shift and dissolve in the moonlight. His mind churned with memories, his mother cooking lentils in a small kitchen, his father tightening the bolts of an old bicycle in the courtyard, the sound of cricket matches on the neighbor's television. But there was another memory too, one he hadn't thought about in years, of the day he left. His father had walked him to the train station. They hadn't spoken much. Sundar had been too busy thinking of America, of the future, of what he thought he needed to become. He remembered glancing back just once and seeing his father standing there on the platform, toolbox still in hand, staring after him. And now he wondered what had his father wanted to say that day. When the plane landed, the early morning sun was just breaking over the horizon, casting everything in a soft golden light. The air smelled of dust and spice and something else he couldn't name. Something that felt like home. He hired a car and gave the driver the address of the house, where he'd grown up. As they drove through the winding streets, Sundar pressed his forehead to the window and watched the city wake up. Children in uniforms chased each other down narrow alleys. Women carried baskets of vegetables to market, and old men sipped chai outside tiny shops. When the car finally stopped in front of the house, Sundar just sat there for a moment, staring. It looked smaller now. The paint was peeling and the roof sagged in places, but it was unmistakably his home. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly to the door. His hand hovered over the handle for a long moment before he finally pushed. It opened. The air inside was cool and still. The walls were lined with old photographs and shelves of books. In the corner, the same cracked radio from his childhood sat on a small table. Silent now. And then he heard it. The faint sound of someone moving in the next room. He followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest, until he reached the doorway to the tiny kitchen. And there, sitting at the table with his back to the door, was his father. He was older now, his hair thin and white, his shoulders stooped, but he still wore the same quiet dignity. Sundar remembered. For a long time Sundar just stood there, unable to speak. Finally his father turned. Their eyes met, and Sundar felt everything. The years, the distance, the unspoken words crash over him at once. But before he could say anything, his father spoke first. You finally came back, he said softly. Then, without another word, he stood and opened a drawer in the cabinet. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed and untouched, and handed it to Sundar. Sundar took it with shaking hands. I wrote this, his father said quietly, the day you left. Sundar stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Open it, his father said. But just as he started to tear the seal, the door behind him creaked open, and Sundar froze when he heard the voice, a voice identical to his own. Not yet, said the younger Sundar, stepping into the kitchen. You're not ready. The room seemed to grow colder. Sundar looked between his father and his younger self, his heart racing. What is this? Sundar whispered, gripping the envelope tightly. The younger Sundar just smiled faintly, his dark eyes glittering. The truth, he said, and it's waiting for you. And as the light outside the window dimmed and the shadows lengthened, Sundar realized he had just one night left, and that whatever was inside the envelope would change everything. Asterisk, the choice of kitchen felt impossibly small as Sundar stood between his father and his younger self, the envelope still trembling in his hands. Outside the window, the early evening light had faded to a deep blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The air inside was thick and quiet, as though even the walls were waiting for him to do what he had avoided for so long. His father sat back down at the small wooden table without saying another word, his face unreadable. The younger Sundar stood in the corner, arms crossed, his dark eyes fixed on him with something that looked almost like pity. Sundar's fingers tightened around the envelope. He wanted to tear it open and read the words inside, but he was afraid. Afraid of what they would say, afraid of what they would reveal about him, about the choices he'd made and the people he'd hurt along the way. He sank into the chair across from his father and set the envelope on the table between them. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Sundar stared at his father's hands, hands that had once built bicycles for him, repaired broken radios, and silently pushed him toward a future they both barely understood. Finally, his father cleared his throat. It was never just about you, he said quietly. Sundar's chest tightened. He looked up at his father, whose eyes now glistened faintly under the weak light. All those years, his father continued, you thought I was proud of what you became, and but I was also afraid that in chasing everything out there, you would lose what was right here. Sundar lowered his gaze. His throat burned with words he couldn't find. In the corner, the younger Sundar spoke at last, his voice steady and low. You left both of us, he said. You left her, and you left him, and you left yourself. The words settled heavily in the room. Slowly, Sundar reached for the envelope again. This time he tore the seal carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper, thin and yellowed with time. His father watched him silently, and his younger self stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. The letter was written in his father's precise, slanting handwriting. My son, I don't know if you'll ever read this. You're leaving today, and I want you to know I understand why. You've always wanted more than this small life we could give you. You've always seen something bigger out there, and I could never hold that against you. But I hope you also remember this. Your dreams mean nothing if you forget the people who love you. They mean nothing if you forget where you came from. If you forget yourself. I built bicycles so you could ride to school. I fixed radios so you could hear the world beyond these walls. But I did it because I thought you would carry us with you, not leave us behind. So when you're out there and the world feels too loud, too fast, come home. Even if you think it's too late, come home, because I will still be here, and so will you. Your father. When Sundar finished reading, his hands were shaking. He set the letter down on the table and covered his face with his hands. He could feel the tears hot against his palms, but he didn't try to stop them. He felt a hand on his shoulder, then not his father's, but his younger self's. You don't have much time, the younger Sundar said softly. It's almost midnight. Sundar looked up sharply. What happens at midnight? The younger Sundar just shook his head. That's not the right question. The question is, who do you want to be when the clock strikes? Sundar sat there for a long moment, staring at the letter, at the photograph of Anjali still in his pocket, at the quiet figure of his father sitting across from him. He thought of everything, the years of ambition, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings, the headlines with his name in them, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if all of it had been worth the price. He stood slowly and turned to his father. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. For everything. For forgetting. His father nodded once, and for the first time in decades, Sundar saw a faint smile on his face. He turned next to his younger self, who was still watching him with those same dark eyes. "You can stop following me now," Sundar said quietly, but the younger Sundar shook his head. "You still don't understand," he replied. "I'm not following you. I'm waiting for you to catch up." Sundar blinked, and just like that, his younger self vanished. He was left alone in the kitchen with his father, the letter, and the faint echo of those words in his ears. Outside, the stars burned brighter now, and the sound of the city drifted. In through the window, laughter, footsteps, the distant whistle of a train. Sundar stepped outside into the courtyard. Feeling the cool earth beneath his feet, the smell of jasmine on the night air, he tilted his head back and looked at the stars for a long time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of Anjali, running his thumb gently over her smile. Then he looked back at the house, where his father still sat in the kitchen. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something shift inside him, something that felt a little like peace. The clock struck midnight. But Sundar didn't feel like he was running out of time anymore. He felt like he was, finally, right where he belonged. Asterisk.